Good morning. I'm Winnie Breegle, as most of you know. I'm happy to share with you today some of my life experiences, some of my thoughts, especially experiences as a woman in military service, but I go all the way back to World War II and the early 1940s. I hope you'll find what I have to say interesting, informative, maybe even a little entertaining as we go along. But most of what I say, probably you will not read in the history books. I've always been interested in the role of women in history and their contributions to society. The part that women have played in changing history and how events in history have impacted their lives and changed their lives also. It's been a sort of two-way street, so to speak. However, today, my primary focus will be the history of women in military service and how World War II drastically changed the role of women in our society. My secondary focus will be the Navajo code talkers and how World War II influenced and changed their way of life also, as well as life in general on their reservation. I had the unexpected privilege of working and being associated with them and have the greatest respect for them and their service to this country. When we think about women in the military, we can go all the way back over 200 years to the Revolutionary War to find women wanting to serve their country. Deborah Sampson was one of these women. She distinguished herself and disguised herself as a man and treated her own combat wounds in order to keep her secret. But she was finally discharged after her third injury when an Army doctor discovered that she was a woman. During the Civil War, women, both black and white, served as nurses, saboteurs, scouts, and couriers. A few even led troops into battle as color bearers, and many helped prisoner and slaves escape. But they were never considered officially a part of the military forces. During the Spanish-American War, the Army-Navy Nurse Corps was created. And in World War I, women did serve also as nurses, Army switchboard operators, and secretaries. Then in 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, big word, which gave women a permanent place in the armed forces. World War II drastically changed the role of women in our own country. Before that time, if women worked outside the home, they were usually secretaries, telephone operators, nurses, or domestic servants. And married women seldom were hired even for these jobs. When I began my teaching career in Ohio in the early 40s, for example, married women did not teach school in that state. If you married during the school year, you were immediately replaced and you went home. But that too changed with World War II because of the teacher shortage caused by the war. In World War II, more than 400,000 women enlisted in all 5 military branches. Today, nearly 2 million women have served in all the branches since America was founded. Those of us who enlisted in the 40s made history and broke barriers. We were the first women to be an official part of the military and the first women to be issued commissions as officers. Today in Washington, D.C., we have our own Women's Military Memorial. Not only did women serve in the military, though, during the war, they also worked in war plants, in shipyards, and other areas. It was a total effort. This was really a first for women. When the Japanese carried out their sneak attack on our fleet that was anchored in Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and began to take over all the Pacific Islands, the United States had to rush into war production and begin to draft men for combat. We had been trying to stay out of the actual fighting and we were really unprepared for war at that time. The attack on our fleet was truly a sneak attack because the Japanese ambassador was in Washington, D.C., promising peace, promising they would not attack, while their 1- and 2-man subs were under our ships in Pearl Harbor waiting for the attack. So after this happened, we had to immediately find a way to establish a foothold in the Pacific. We had to stave off the enemy from our west coast. We could be speaking Japanese today if they had come on. And prevent our communications from being decoded by the highly trained, ingenious Japanese cryptographers. I remember this period as scary, emotional, but a very exciting time. Since this was the very first time women served as commissioned officers, I like to think I played at least a small part as one of this group of pioneers in changing the role of women in our country. I spent 5 years on active duty and about 10 years more on inactive as a Navy coding officer or cryptographer in the waves. I also was attached to the Secret Service. I had to have this clearance because of the work that I did. Often I acted as a courier to carry top secret messages, both coded and uncoded, to the White House and other Washington area institutions, so that pass was essential for me. I can honestly tell you that this tour of duty was one of the most exciting and greatest experiences of my entire 85 years. I read a plaque once that said, "A woman who behaves herself never makes history." I don't really believe that because I think I've behaved fairly well, and I believe I've helped to shape the history of women in some small way too. But to get back to the subject at hand, everyone was so angry with the Japanese that both men and women enlisted by the thousands to help defeat them. Also, thousands of 17 and 18-year-old high school boys enlisted as well, having to have parents' signature to do so. My own 17-year-old brother was one of these. Compared to the attitude and mood of the country today, this was a whole different time. If you didn't live in that time, it's hard to realize and hard to understand the difference in the mood. I don't recall ever seeing a protester, and there was no partisanship as today. It was a cooperative effort for survival. This was uppermost in our minds. Everybody was involved in some way in the war effort. Even children collected tinfoil from gum wrappers and made it into big balls and saved that so it could be used. President George H.W. Bush, who was a decorated Navy pilot in the war, joined the armed forces on his 18th birthday in 1942. He flew torpedo bombers off the aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto. And at the christening of the latest nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which was named for him last year, he had this to say, and I'm quoting, "After our nation was attacked at Pearl Harbor, you simply couldn't find anyone who wasn't anxious to sign up. The point is that our nation was totally united against the insidious totalitarian threat against our freedom," unquote. And he was right about that. When I first began thinking about enlisting, I was a 21-year-old newlywed. My husband had enlisted in the Army Air Corps a few months before we were married, and he was already serving as a radio operator, ground-to-air communications, directing planes in the Pacific area. I had been a high school teacher of Latin, Spanish, and English for a little over 1 year. And with both my husband and brother in the service, I just felt I couldn't stay there and teach school and not be a part of this also. So I went to the nearest Navy recruiting station, which was at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I enlisted. I passed the physical. I brought my papers back to my principal, and I was walking on air. He would have to sign my release from my teaching contract. I wasn't prepared for what happened next, but I was determined to go to the Navy. It so happened that teachers, along with telephone operators and welders in the steel industry, were considered essential to the home front. Imagine being considered essential anywhere. So they were not drafted. It was the month of February in the school year, and the principal refused to release me from my contract. Not that I was indispensable, you understand, but with everyone involved in the war effort, he said he wouldn't be able to find a replacement for the next 4 months of school. And he was already angry with me because I had married my husband before he went overseas without notifying him or the school board that I was now married. So I wore my wedding ring for a few months in a locket around my neck. But before school was out that spring, they were updating records and going over everything to see about the next school year. So I had to tell him. Well, you know what happened. He was really angry. He was so angry, he said, "You'll have to give back your salary that you've earned during this school year." And our salary then was $105 a month for 9 months. You know. He said I had taken that under false pretenses. So I guess for him, this was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. But I was really devastated. I had made up my mind I was going, and I had to find a way to get there. So I went back to the Navy recruiter, and I asked him what I could do. He didn't hesitate a minute. He just reached across his desk, took my papers, and signed his name to release me from my contract. He said to me, "Now go back and tell him you're in the Navy and report for duty in 2 weeks." Well, you know what happened when I went back. He was really angry now, and I won't repeat everything he said, but I still remember the red color that started right here and went all the way to the top of his head. I was frightened. I thought he was going to have a heart attack or a stroke or something. He said to me, "Young lady, you will not have a job when you come back." Well, at that moment, I wasn't thinking about when I was coming back. All I was concerned about was getting there, you know, and he was holding me up. But by the time I got back, Congress had passed a bill saying that all military personnel after the war were to be given their jobs back or an equivalent. So there was no discrimination now either. You know, women had broken that barrier, so married women could teach in that state. So he really had no choice. He had to take me back. But I'll tell you that for the next 2 years until he retired, we just very discreetly avoided each other as much as possible. I stayed away from him and he stayed away from me. Well, finally though, I was in the Navy. But the Navy had no facilities for women, and there wasn't time to construct any. So they housed us in dormitories on various college campuses for our training. My unit was sent to Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. And here we received our training as midshipmen in preparation for being commissioned as ensigns. Among other activities, I still remember very vividly the march to meals 3 times a day, 2 miles there and back. Massachusetts in the middle of February was really cold. I thought I would freeze to death before we finished our march. That 6 weeks of study and training, though, was the hardest work I had ever done in my whole life. Having grown up on a farm in southern Ohio, I thought I really knew what hard work was. You know, back in the 40s, we didn't have all the modern technology and all that. We did everything with our hands. And I thought I'd worked hard in college, but that was a breeze compared to this. About 1/4 of the girls in my unit couldn't hack it, so they dropped out and went back home. It was grueling, I'll tell you, and so different from anything we had ever done, any of us. Well, at the end of 6 weeks, I was given my commission as an ensign and assigned to communications as a coding officer. Well, I knew absolutely nothing about codes at that point, and I was then sent to Mount Holyoke College in Amherst, Massachusetts, the hometown of Emily Dickinson, if you remember. I had here 6 more weeks of very concentrated training, special training in codes, how to make them, how to break them. My first tour of actual duty was in the port director's office in Baltimore, Maryland. We worked with coded messages coming from and going to both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters of the war. Remember, we were fighting on 2 fronts. When ships came into the Baltimore port, they secured their radios and had shore leave, and we took their messages. We then delivered them by launch out to the ship, and of course, that was a fun thing to do. I especially enjoyed this because every type of ship came into that port, even submarines, and I had never been on any big ships before. But in the meantime, both the Germans and Japanese were breaking our codes right and left, so we had to make up new ones often. I was the one at my duty station designated to go to that place where this was being done, memorize the new code, come back and teach it to my fellow officers without writing it down. A written code, you know, is always liable to be compromised or get into the wrong hands. But you can imagine the pressure that was. I was always afraid I'd forget it, you know. And on the way back, I never went to sleep if it was in the middle of the night even. I made myself stay awake so I would not forget. Well, after a year in Baltimore, I was transferred to a very small unit of 10 coding officers at the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. This is where my most exciting and interesting work was done. Our work was so secret, we had to take an oath and sign our life away that we would tell no one about what we did. I laugh about it now, but my roommate and I took it so seriously, we didn't even talk to each other about it when we got back after work and to our apartment. We were constantly being reminded by our superior officers that even the very walls have ears, you know, don't talk. And a slip of the lip can sink a ship. I'm sure you've heard that. Very few people, even at the Navy Department, knew or were aware of what our unit did. At the end of the war, I again had to take an oath that I would tell no one about what we had done. And I was not given a discharge for about 10 years. I was just released to inactive duty until they decided to reveal the code that we had been working with. We didn't know when we got out whether we would ever be able to talk about it. You know, we talked to each other and said, do you think we'll ever know? And we'll be able to tell our families even what we were doing. There's an old corny joke, you know, and I'm sure you might have heard this. If you want news to travel fast, use telephone, telegraph, or tell a woman. I prove that's not always true. I kept that secret for over 25 years. And believe me, it's hard to keep a secret like that. But my family can attest to the fact that I did keep it. They were very surprised, especially my husband was very surprised when he found out what I'd been doing. It seemed to us that we had a lot of free time because of the stress of the work, and since we worked in shifts 24/7. We were coding officers for 4 days, and then we had 2 whole days off. And when we weren't on duty, we certainly took advantage of all the perks of living in Washington, D.C. We were treated royally also by the people. Navy women were still a sort of novelty. Everything was free to us, you know, even bus rides downtown. We never paid for anything. People just became personally involved with us. There weren't too many of us, and they sort of adopted us, I guess. I remember one bus driver, we called him Pop, I don't even remember his name now, but he and his wife brought us all Christmas dinner cooked and ready to eat with all the trimmings, a little decorated Christmas tree for our apartment. That's the kind of thing that they did for us. We had free admittance to all the concerts, the museums, art galleries, movies, all of that. We even visited sessions of Congress, and we ate bean soup with our senators in their dining room. Also, in time off those 2 days, we could travel in the area. We could go wherever we wanted to. We went to Philadelphia and watched an Army-Navy football game. We went to New York City often. As often as we could get there, we went. 5 or 6 of us would stay in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria. That was the place to stay at that time. And a suite cost $100 a night. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but for that time, it was a lot, especially when bread was 10 cents a loaf and gasoline was 25 cents a gallon. Can you believe that? They would bring in cots and rollaway beds for us, and all of us would stay in one suite and pay $10 a night. We saw all the Broadway plays free with USO tickets. We rode the subways all over New York City free of charge. We saw the Rockettes at Radio Music Hall. We went up in the Statue of Liberty. We went to see St. Patrick's Cathedral, visited Times Square. So you can see, for a girl like me who grew up on a farm in Ohio, it was a real education and cost practically nothing. One of the most exciting events for me in Washington was being issued the Secret Service pass that I mentioned before. I had to deliver encoded message to the White House and other military installations, so I needed that pass. I was always chauffeured by a Marine Guard when I acted as a courier delivering these messages. And there was a colonel on duty 24/7 at the White House in the map room. We called it the war room because on the walls were huge maps of the whole world, and all the battles were plotted on those maps. I recall the first time I delivered a message to the colonel. This was, at that time, a little funny thing that happened. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was obvious he wasn't expecting a female caller. Women couriers were not the usual thing. Usually, a male courier carried the message. A few minutes after I knocked on his door, he opened it wide, and there he stood in his boxer shorts. He'd been sleeping on the couch, and I'm sure he thought he was having a nightmare when he saw me. He shut the door immediately without a word. I just stood there waiting, and eventually he opened the door, fully clothed though, and a little red-faced. Now in today's society, neither one of us would probably have been embarrassed. But remember, that was 60 years ago, and times were different then. He didn't comment, he didn't say anything about it, and I didn't either. I just gave him that message and got out of there. But he was always fully clothed when he opened the door every time I took him a message after that. So he knew that women were going to be bringing the messages. I often acted as a courier, carrying the confidential and top secret messages to the military installations. And about once a month, I would travel down the Chesapeake Bay on the rickety old packet boat to the Norfolk Navy Yard carrying messages. So I was issued a holster and a .45 in order to go to target practice every week with the shore patrol. Well, the shore patrol weren't too happy about that at first, but they got used to us after a while. And I eventually got to be a pretty good shot. Today, I wouldn't count on it. If anyone accosted us to try to take the pouch, we were ordered to shoot and ask questions later. Fortunately, I never had to do that. Well, as you can imagine, to a farm girl from Ohio, all this, excuse me. But even better yet, I became one of the very few who worked with or even knew about the Navajo Indian Marine Unit. Sorry, Kim. They were known to us as the Code Talkers. And it wasn't until nearly 30 years after the war ended that their story was revealed by our government. Excuse me. Also, in 2002, a movie was made about them called Wind Talkers, starring Nicolas Cage. When the code was revealed in 1978, everyone who knew about them or who had worked with them was released from his oath of secrecy. So I received a letter from the Navy Department saying now I could talk about what I had done while I was in service. By the way, I think Wind Talkers is a good movie. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's relatively accurate and well done. And even though it's a little violent, it's a war movie after all, it's well worth watching if you're interested in events around that time. The training center for the Code Talkers was first at San Diego and then at Camp Pendleton, California. Many Navajos were recruited by the Marines, but only 420 eventually qualified as Code Talkers. 3 were stationed permanently at San Diego and 3 at Pendleton. The rest served on ships and on all the Pacific Islands. Messages were sent to them by telephone or radio to be transmitted throughout the Pacific area in their code. No message was ever written. All were sent orally. The sender indicated it was for a code talker by inserting the words Arizona or New Mexico somewhere in that message. The communications officer at San Diego or Pendleton would immediately give it to the code talker who was on duty there to send on in his own code. So from one island to another or from ship to shore, messages were sent from one code talker to another and then given to the communications officer when it reached its destination. So besides changing the role of women in our society, the war was also responsible for changing the lives of the code talkers, as well as their people, who had been isolated up to now on the reservation. 13 code talkers were killed in battle, and most of those who survived did not go back to the reservation. By the way, a fellow Marine was always assigned to be a sort of Siamese twin to the code talker to protect him. And when they invaded an island, the code talkers were never in the first wave going in, usually the third wave. At the end of the war, the genie was out of the bottle for both American women and the code talkers, and it couldn't be put back. The world for both groups would never be the same as before. At the request of my family, I'm now in the process of writing a book about my military experience and my life in general. And this will be one of the chapters. What I'm telling you today is I'm putting that in my book. In June of last year, I spent a wonderful week in Washington, D.C., revisiting my old haunts and visiting the Women's Military Memorial to see and obtain a copy of my registration, which is recorded there, and it's on the table over there. The lady in charge there seemed really happy to see me, and I wondered why she was so gracious and so hospitable. She said they didn't often have visits from the women veterans themselves of World War II, usually from their children or their grandchildren, because the veterans were either not physically able to travel because of age or health. You know, all of us who survive are in the 80 to 90 age range, or they were no longer living. She looked up at me, she was this little lady, she looked up at me and smiled and she said, "I don't believe you fit either category." So she gave me the royal tour of the memorial, and along with the copy of my registration and a picture of the memorial itself. The Women's Military Memorial is located at the entrance to Arlington Cemetery. And while I was there, I witnessed the military funeral cortege of a young soldier who had been killed in Iraq. I again was reminded in a very graphic way that even after so many years, our military men and women are still fighting and dying to protect our freedom and our way of life. This Women's Military Memorial is not to honor just World War II women, though, but all women who have ever served in the United States military branches. And unlike with most memorials, you don't have to be dead to be registered there. Please encourage any woman you know who is a veteran or who is currently serving to become registered there if she hasn't already done so. We're having a drive to get as many as possible registered in that memorial, and I have the information if anybody needs that. Well, while I was in Washington, I visited another very impressive and recently completed memorial to honor all servicemen and women who died fighting in World War II. On one of its walls are 4,000 gold stars, one star for each 100 who died in the war, 400,000 in all. And what an impressive sight that wall is with its gold stars. On another wall of the same memorial, I read this inscription: "Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not just as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it." I'd like to tell you a little more about the code talkers themselves and explain their code briefly. I personally have the greatest respect for these men and for what they did to help win the war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, this country faced an almost impossible task: regaining dominance of and control